August 20th, 1942. A wounded Japanese lieutenant stands behind barbed wire on Guadalcanal, watching a 15-ton American machine roll off a transport ship. In the next 8 hours, that single piece of equipment will accomplish what would have taken 200 Japanese soldiers an entire week. The lieutenant's name is Teeshi Yamamoto. He was a civil engineering student before the war. He knew every formula for calculating human labor. He could tell you exactly how many men it took to dig a trench, build a runway, or construct a defensive position. But standing at that wire, watching that gray-painted Caterpillar D7 bulldozer rumble past, he realized something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Everything he had been taught was wrong. Every calculation was obsolete. Every assumption about Japanese superiority was a lie. In less than 90 minutes, he would witness American machines repair bomb craters that should have taken 2 days to fix. He would watch one operator do the work of 500 men. And he would understand with mathematical certainty that Japan had already lost the war before it truly began. If you're enjoying this deep dive into history, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. The Pacific War in 1942 was supposed to follow a simple script. Japan would seize territory, build impregnable defenses, and make the cost of reconquest so astronomical that America would negotiate peace. This strategy relied on one fundamental assumption. Building fortifications was labor-intensive. Attacking fortifications was even more labor-intensive. As long as Japanese soldiers could dig faster than American soldiers could assault the math-favored defense. The Japanese military had perfected this calculation over decades. During the Russo-Japanese War, they learned that disciplined troops with shovels could construct defensive networks faster than any enemy could breach them. In China, they refined these techniques further. Entire military installations rose from jungle and mountain terrain using nothing but hand tools and human muscle. The formula was elegant in its brutality. 1,000 men could build a runway in 2 weeks. 500 men could construct a defensive line in 10 days. 200 men could dig an anti-tank ditch in 1 week. These numbers governed Japanese military engineering like sacred texts. They had been tested, verified, and elevated to doctrine in every field manual. The human body was the fundamental unit of construction, and Japan had millions of bodies to spend. American forces, meanwhile, were considered soft. Japanese propaganda painted them as wealthy, comfortable people who lacked the spiritual strength for real warfare. They had factories and machines, yes, but these material advantages would crumble against Japanese willpower. American soldiers expected hot meals and clean uniforms. American workers went on strike when conditions were not perfect. Their entire civilization was built on comfort and convenience, which meant they could never understand that war was about endurance, suffering, and the willingness to die for a cause greater than oneself. This narrative saturated every level of Japanese military culture. Officers repeated it in speeches. Training instructors hammered it into recruits. The message was clear and consistent. Spirit would always triumph over steel. Bushido would defeat machines. The samurai heritage of self-sacrifice would overwhelm any material advantage the Americans could muster. Japanese soldiers believed this completely. They had seen the evidence with their own eyes in Manchuria, where human labor had carved roads through mountains and built bridges over gorges without a single piece of heavy equipment. When you had enough men and could push them hard enough, machines became unnecessary luxuries. But everything was about to change because of one man nobody was paying attention to. Lieutenant Teeshi Yamamoto had been captured 3 days before the bulldozer arrived. He was found by Marine scouts in a collapsed bunker alongside 2 dead comrades and 0 ammunition. A tropical fever had saved his life. He was too sick to resist, too weak to reach for the grenade he had been issued for final purposes. Now, recovering in the American prisoner enclosure, he spent his days observing the enemy he had been taught to despise. Yamamoto was not an ordinary soldier. Before conscription in 1941, he had been studying civil engineering at Waseda University, one of Japan's most prestigious institutions. His training as an Imperial Japanese Army engineer had been thorough and brutal, focused entirely on maximizing human labor efficiency. He could calculate exactly how many backs it took to move a ton of supplies, how many hours of digging equaled one fortified position, how many men would die from exhaustion before a project was completed. These calculations were built into every formula. Human cost was simply another variable to optimize. Standing at the wire that August morning, Yamamoto watched the Caterpillar D7 roll toward what had been dense jungle just beyond Henderson Field's perimeter. The area was scheduled to become an ammunition dump, according to signs posted nearby. His engineer's mind immediately began calculating. For this plot, roughly 200 yards by 100 yards, Japanese military doctrine prescribed a minimum force of 200 men working for 5 days. That assumed good weather, adequate tools, and acceptable casualty rates from falling trees and tropical disease. The mathematics were straightforward. The human cost was built into the equation. The bulldozer operator, a Seabee wearing a faded khaki shirt with rolled sleeves, lit a cigarette, adjusted something on the control panel, and released the brake. The D7 lurched forward with its blade angled down and struck the first tree. It was a palm roughly 20 feet tall with a trunk as thick as a man's torso. The blade hit with a grinding shriek of wood fibers shearing, and the tree toppled in seconds. The bulldozer did not pause. It rolled over the fallen trunk and pushed it aside like garbage. Second tree. Third tree. Fourth tree. The machine advanced in a straight line, its treads chewing through undergrowth, its blade knocking down everything in its path. This was impossible. This violated every calculation Yamamoto had ever learned. Other Japanese prisoners gathered at the wire drawn by the sound. They stood in silence, calculating the same impossible arithmetic. One machine was doing the work of 50 men, maybe 100. The operator appeared to be completely alone. No support crew visible, no laborers following to clear debris. Just one man on one machine erasing jungle faster than an entire company of soldiers with axes and saws could have managed. A prisoner named Fujita, who had been a construction foreman in Osaka before the war, finally spoke. "How many cubic meters per hour?" His voice was distant, almost mechanical. Yamamoto tried to calculate it. He could not. The rate of work exceeded every formula he had been taught. His engineering training had no category for this scale of mechanical efficiency. The bulldozer worked through the entire morning. By noon, when the operator stopped for lunch and climbed down to eat a sandwich in the shade, roughly 1/3 of the jungle plot had been cleared. Yamamoto ran the numbers with increasing disbelief. At this rate, the entire area would be finished in 2 days. Maybe less. One machine. One operator. What would have taken 200 Japanese soldiers a week of brutal labor, this single piece of equipment was accomplishing in a fraction of the time. With 0 casualties. No exhaustion breaks. No need for food distribution or medical treatment for injuries. The operator finished his sandwich, drank from a canteen, tossed the wax paper in a bin attached to the bulldozer, and climbed back up. The engine coughed and roared to life. By evening, the clearing was 3/4 complete. The bulldozer had worked approximately 8 hours with one break. In that time, it had removed what Yamamoto conservatively estimated would have required 1,500 man-hours of labor. He ran the numbers again, certain he had made an error. He had not. The machine had literally done the work of 200 men in a single day. And this was just clearing. He had not even begun to consider the implications for grading, excavation, road building, all the tasks that formed the backbone of military engineering. If American machines could operate at this ratio across all construction tasks, then the entire Japanese approach to logistics and infrastructure was not merely inefficient. It was completely and fundamentally obsolete. That night in the prisoner enclosure, the Japanese captives talked in quiet voices about what they had witnessed. Most were infantry, with no formal engineering background, but they understood labor. They dug foxholes and trenches. They hauled supplies up jungle hills. They constructed defensive positions from logs and sandbags. They knew exactly how much work their bodies could perform before collapse, how many hours they could dig before their hands bled through calluses, how many trips they could make carrying ammunition before their legs gave out. The bulldozer had demolished their understanding of what was possible. One prisoner, a former miner from Hokkaido, suggested the machine must require enormous amounts of fuel. Rare expertise to operate constant maintenance. Surely there were hidden costs that balanced the equation. Yamamoto wanted to believe this. He clung to the hope through the darkness. But he had watched the operator carefully. The man had looked bored. He had smoked cigarettes while driving. He had adjusted controls with casual familiarity. He had shown no sign that this was difficult or specialized work. The machine had not broken down. It had not required a maintenance crew. It had not exhibited any of the fragility that should accompany such power. Over the following days, more machines arrived. Bulldozers, graders, earth movers, trucks with specialized equipment. Yamamoto could not immediately identify. The American construction effort around Henderson Field accelerated to a pace that violated everything he understood about military engineering. They were building roads, storage facilities, ammunition dumps, fuel depots, repair shops, medical stations. In the time it would have taken a Japanese engineer battalion just to plan such an operation. The Seabees worked in shifts around the clock. Their machines roared through darkness illuminated by portable lights powered by generators. The Americans had electricity in the jungle. They had mobile workshops with lathes and welding equipment. They had spare parts for everything. When a bulldozer broke down, they fixed it in hours and returned it to work. When they needed a new road, they built it in days. But this was only the beginning of Yamamoto's education. 3 weeks after his capture, he witnessed something that completed his psychological transformation. A Japanese air raid struck Henderson Field just after dawn. 6 bombers scored direct hits on the runway, cratering the coral surface in 3 places. Each hole was roughly 15 feet across and 6 feet deep. It was excellent work, the kind of damage that would have crippled a Japanese airfield for days. Standard repair procedure required at least 100 men per crater, working 12 to 16 hours. 3 craters meant 300 men, minimum possibly 2 full days, before aircraft could use the runway again. The American response began within minutes. 2 bulldozers rolled onto the runway while the all-clear siren was still echoing. Dump trucks followed with crushed coral. A grader smoothed everything flat. 90 minutes after the bombs hit, aircraft were landing on the repaired runway. 90 minutes. 2 bulldozers. Perhaps 20 American personnel total. They had accomplished what would have required 300 Japanese laborers working for 2 days. Fujita joined Yamamoto at the wire. They watched American planes take off from the runway that had been cratered less than 2 hours earlier. "We have already lost," Fujita said quietly. "Even if we win every battle, we have already lost." But the prisoners did not yet understand the full scale of what American mechanization would mean for the Pacific War. They had witnessed construction. They had not yet seen what these same industrial principles would do when applied to destruction. In Part 2, we will follow Yamamoto through the next 18 months as American Seabee battalions transform the entire Pacific Theater building bases faster than Japan can destroy them, repairing damage faster than Japan can inflict it, and establishing a logistical superiority so overwhelming that the outcome of every future battle was determined before the first shot was fired. The ratio was not 500 to 1. For some tasks, it was closer to 1,000 to 1. And Japan had no answer. In Part 1, we watched Lieutenant Teeshi Yamamoto stand behind barbed wire on Guadalcanal, as a single American bulldozer accomplished what would have taken 200 Japanese soldiers an entire week. We saw him calculate the impossible arithmetic. We witnessed his world collapse as 90 minutes of mechanical work replaced 2 days of human labor. But Yamamoto had only begun to understand the full scale of American industrial superiority. The machines he witnessed in those first weeks were just the opening act. What came next would reveal something far more devastating. Not just that America had better equipment, but that the entire Japanese military philosophy, the doctrine of human sacrifice that had governed their strategy since the Russo-Japanese War, was not merely outdated. It was suicidal. And the numbers were about to get much, much worse. The Seabees kept building through September and October of 1942. Yamamoto watched from the prisoner enclosure as Henderson Field transformed from a captured Japanese airstrip into a sprawling American military complex. The construction never stopped. Day shifts merged into night shifts. Machines roared under portable floodlights, while generators hummed in the tropical darkness. The Americans had brought electricity to the jungle. They had brought running water. They had brought refrigeration units that kept food fresh and medical supplies stable. Each new capability seemed impossible until Yamamoto saw it functioning with his own eyes. The prisoner population grew as American forces pushed deeper into Guadalcanal. New captives arrived weekly, each group bringing fresh observations of American mechanization. A corporal from the 28th Infantry described watching Seabees construct a bridge over a 30-foot ravine that his unit had been using as a natural defensive barrier. Japanese engineers had calculated it would take Americans at least a week to span the gap. The Seabees completed the bridge in 6 hours, using prefabricated steel sections and a mobile crane. By the time the Japanese counterattack was organized, American tanks were already rolling across. A sergeant from an artillery unit told of watching his battery's carefully prepared firing positions get erased in a single afternoon. Japanese crews had spent 3 weeks constructing those positions. Ammunition storage bunkers dug by hand. Protective berms built from thousands of sandbags filled one at a time. Camouflage networks woven from jungle vegetation. The American response was 2 bulldozers and a flamethrower tank. Everything the sergeant's men had built disappeared in 4 hours. The machinery did not discriminate between weeks of labor and minutes of existence. It simply pushed forward blade down, erasing human effort with mechanical indifference. Yamamoto collected these stories with the obsessive focus of an engineer documenting a new phenomenon. He organized the data in his mind, comparing Japanese construction times against American destruction times, calculating the ratios, searching for patterns. The mathematics were consistent and devastating. For every task he analyzed, American machines outperformed Japanese labor by factors of 50 to 500, sometimes more. The ratio was not linear. It compounded across every stage of military engineering. Fujita, the former construction foreman, helped Yamamoto understand what they were really witnessing. "It is not individual machines," Fujita explained one evening in the enclosure. "It is the system. Look at how everything connects." He pointed toward a construction site visible through the wire. A bulldozer had leveled the ground. A grader had smoothed it. Trucks were arriving with pre-cut lumber. A crew with power tools was assembling a structure. Every step feeds the next step. The bulldozer prepares for the grader. The grader prepares for the builders. The builders have tools that match the materials. Nothing is wasted. No effort is duplicated. Yamamoto understood immediately. Japanese military engineering used machines when available trucks for transport tractors for heavy pulling. But these were additions to a system built around human labor. The Americans had designed their entire approach around mechanization with humans serving only as machine operators. The difference was philosophical. Japan automated when convenient. America assumed automation and added humans only where absolutely necessary. This meant American forces could achieve engineering projects that were literally impossible for Japanese units, regardless of how many men Tokyo was willing to sacrifice. You could not compensate for a lack of bulldozers by throwing more bodies at jungle terrain. Human muscle had a maximum efficiency. American machines had blown past that maximum so completely that comparison became meaningless. The strategic implications were staggering. Japanese defensive doctrine relied on making territory expensive to capture. Build fortifications. Force the enemy to pay in blood for every position. Make the cost of conquest so high that negotiation becomes preferable to continued fighting. But this logic assumed symmetrical costs. It assumed that building defenses was as difficult as breaking them. American mechanization destroyed that symmetry entirely. Japanese forces could spend months creating elaborate defensive networks, pouring human labor into bunkers and tunnels and obstacles. The Americans would arrive with bulldozers and combat engineers and specialized demolition equipment. They would reduce those months of work to rubble in days, sometimes hours. The construction cost was not symmetrical at all. It cost Japan far more to build defenses than it cost America to destroy them. Yamamoto tried to calculate the fuel economics one afternoon, piecing together information from guard conversations and his own observations. A Caterpillar D7 bulldozer consumed roughly 5 gallons of diesel per hour under working load. 8 hours of operation meant 40 gallons. This sounded substantial until you compared it to the human equivalent. The 200 men that Bulldozer replaced each required approximately 3,000 calories daily in tropical working conditions. That translated to roughly 7 pounds of rice per man. 200 men consumed 1,400 pounds of food every day, plus water, plus medical supplies for the inevitable tropical diseases and work injuries. The bulldozer needed 40 gallons of fuel, a few gallons of lubricant, and occasional spare parts. Even accounting for maintenance requirements and operator supplies, the logistical burden was a fraction of supporting 200 laborers, and the bulldozer could work 24 hours if necessary. It never contracted malaria. It never required rest days for exhaustion. It never died from tropical disease. America could afford to run these machines everywhere because they had the industrial capacity to produce fuel and parts in quantities that seemed fictional to Japanese prisoners. The Seabees had spare bulldozers. They had backup generators. They had replacement parts for everything. When equipment broke, they fixed it in hours and returned it to work. When they needed more machines, ships arrived with additional equipment. The supply seemed limitless from Japanese perspective. Meanwhile, Japan struggled to fuel its existing vehicle fleet. Every drop of petroleum was either imported from occupied territories or synthesized at enormous cost. The idea of burning 40 gallons of diesel daily just to move Earth was impossible luxury. Japanese engineers used human muscle instead. Not because it was more effective, because bodies were the one resource Japan still had in abundance. This was the hidden mathematics of the Pacific War. Japan's strategic poverty meant accepting human costs that mechanization could have eliminated. They dug with shovels because they could not afford bulldozers. They carried supplies on their backs because they could not afford trucks. They sacrificed men in suicidal charges because they could not afford the tanks and artillery that would have accomplished the same objectives with fewer casualties. The propaganda had disguised this poverty as virtue. Japanese soldiers were taught that their willingness to suffer proved their spiritual superiority over soft, mechanized Americans. But suffering was not virtue. It was the compensation of those too poor and backward to build proper machines. Yamamoto had spent his entire military career inside this lie. He had believed that Japanese spirit would overcome American materialism. He had accepted that hardship built character, and that endurance through pain was what separated the Japanese warrior from lesser peoples. Now he understood the truth. Spirit did not overcome factories. Discipline did not defeat assembly lines. Courage did not outweigh industrial capacity, measured in millions of tons of steel. The answer had always been no. The Japanese military command must have known this. They had seen the production figures before the war. American industrial output was public knowledge. They had chosen to attack anyway. They had sent millions of men to fight an enemy that could outproduce them 50-1. And when those men died starving in jungles or drowning when transport ships were sunk or blown apart by American artillery, the command called it honorable sacrifice. They called it the Japanese way. December 1942 brought the rainy season to Guadalcanal. Tropical downpours turned unpaved areas into mud seas. Japanese prisoners expected the American construction effort to halt. Rain stopped human labor. Rain made digging impossible. Rain turned every project into a waiting game. The Seabees kept working. Their machines had diesel engines that functioned regardless of weather. Their bulldozers pushed through mud that would have stopped human crews entirely. Their trucks had four-wheel drive systems that maintained traction on saturated ground. The rain did not slow them. It barely inconvenienced them. They built roads through downpours, graded surfaces between storms, continued their transformation of the island with mechanical persistence that ignored conditions entirely. Yamamoto watched from the enclosure as Seabees constructed a drainage system during a monsoon. American engineers had anticipated the rainy season. They had brought corrugated steel pipe sections and prefabricated culvert components. While Japanese prisoners huddled under whatever shelter they could find, American machines were installing infrastructure designed to keep the base operational through any weather. The psychological effect on the prisoners was devastating. These were men trained to see hardship as proof of virtue. They had been broken down through deliberate brutality, taught to view their bodies as expendable tools in the emperor's service. The idea that mechanization could replace human sacrifice was not just practically unsettling. It was spiritually offensive. It suggested that all their suffering had been pointless, that the virtue they had cultivated through pain was merely the mark of their nation's backwardness. If one bulldozer equaled 500 men, then what did that say about the 500? What did it say about the entire Japanese military system, which treated those 500 bodies as the baseline unit of calculation? Some prisoners broke completely. They stopped eating, stopped talking, sat in the enclosure, staring at nothing. The American guards called it depression. Yamamoto thought it was more accurate to call it philosophical collapse. These were men whose entire understanding of themselves had been organized around the idea that they were superior to soft mechanized Americans. Confronting undeniable evidence that mechanization was actually superiority shattered them completely. Others adapted by inverting their worldview. If Japanese propaganda had been lies, maybe American propaganda was truth. If Japanese strength had been weakness, maybe American weakness was strength. These prisoners studied English with desperate intensity. They asked guards questions about America, trying to understand the industrial culture that could produce bulldozers by the thousand. They wanted to know about American factories, American schools, American agriculture, everything that fed the machine production they witnessed daily. The guards, mostly young men from farms and small towns who had never thought deeply about industrial capacity, tried to explain. America had a lot of factories. America had good roads. America had machines for everything. The prisoners pressed for specifics. How many automobiles did America produce annually? How many tons of steel? How much electricity? The guards did not know precise figures, but they knew it was a lot, more than Japan, more than seemed reasonable to men from a nation where most families did not own cars. By early 1943, the American presence on Guadalcanal had transformed into something resembling a small industrial city. The Seabees had constructed miles of roads, multiple supply depots, fuel storage facilities, repair shops, medical facilities, housing for thousands of personnel, and expanded Henderson Field to accommodate far more aircraft than the original Japanese strip could have supported. The construction had happened in roughly 5 months. Yamamoto calculated what Japanese forces would have needed to accomplish the same work. Tens of thousands of laborers, multiple engineer battalions, supply lines bringing food and tools, medical facilities handling casualties from construction accidents, and years, not months. Probably 3 years of continuous work to build what Americans had completed in a single season. A Seabee battalion numbered roughly 1,000 men with 20 to 30 major pieces of construction equipment. Based on everything Yamamoto had witnessed, this single battalion was performing engineering work equivalent to at least 5,000 Japanese laborers, maybe 10,000. The ratio was impossible to pin down precisely because the Americans were not just working faster. They were working continuously in conditions that would have stopped human crews entirely. The war continued beyond Guadalcanal through 1943 and into 1944. New prisoners arrived with reports from other islands. Seabees on New Caledonia had built an entire naval base in 6 months. Seabees on Efate had carved an airfield from jungle in 8 weeks. Seabees on Espiritu Santo had constructed a supply depot that handled more monthly tonnage than some Japanese home ports. Every report confirmed the same pattern. American forces arrived with machines-built infrastructure at impossible speed and established logistical superiority that made tactical advantages overwhelming. They were not just winning battles. They were industrializing the Pacific Islands, turning primitive coastlines into military bases faster than Japan could organize effective resistance. And the machines that seemed so impressive when applied to construction became terrifying when turned to destruction. But the prisoners did not yet understand the final implication of American mechanization. They had watched construction transform Guadalcanal. They had heard reports of similar transformations across the Pacific. They had calculated the ratios and recognized the mathematical hopelessness of Japan's position. What they had not yet grasped was what all this industrial capacity would mean when America finally turned from defense to offense. When they stopped building bases and started building the fleet that would carry those bases forward. When they stopped preparing and started advancing. When the same factories that produced bulldozers began producing bombers in quantities that would darken the skies over Japanese cities. In Part 3, we will follow the Pacific War through 1944 as American mechanization reaches its full devastating potential. Island after island will fall to combined arms offensives where Japanese fortifications measured in months of human labor are reduced to rubble in hours by naval bombardment and combat engineering. The ratio that seemed impossible on Guadalcanal will prove to be merely the beginning, and Lieutenant Yamamoto will learn that the bulldozers were never the real threat. They were just the visible edge of an industrial machine that was preparing to erase everything he had known. In Part 1, Lieutenant Teeshi Yamamoto watched a single American bulldozer accomplish what would have taken 200 Japanese soldiers a week. In Part 2, he witnessed the Seabees transform Guadalcanal into a sprawling military complex in 5 months' work that would have required Japanese forces 3 years to complete. He calculated the ratios. He understood the mathematics. He recognized that Japan had been defeated before the real fighting even began. But Yamamoto had only seen construction. He had watched Americans build. Now in 1944, he would witness what happened when that same industrial capacity turned from building bases to destroying armies. The bulldozers had been merely preparation. The machines of construction were now joined by machines of annihilation. And the numbers that had seemed impossible on Guadalcanal were about to become catastrophic across the entire Pacific theater. The American offensive began in earnest in late 1943 and accelerated through 1944. Yamamoto still held on. Guadalcanal received information from newly captured prisoners who had witnessed the island-hopping campaign firsthand. Each group brought reports more devastating than the last. Tarawa in November 1943, Kwajalein in February 1944, Eniwetok days later, Saipan in June, Guam in July, Tinian in August. The pace was impossible by Japanese strategic calculations. Tokyo had expected Americans to spend months preparing each assault building up supplies, constructing forward bases, accumulating the logistics necessary for amphibious operations. Instead, the Americans attacked continuously. They seized islands, built airfields within days, and launched the next offensive before Japanese command could organize effective response. The Seabees made this tempo possible. They landed alongside combat troops, sometimes ahead of them. While Marines and Army infantry secured beachheads, construction battalions were already unloading bulldozers and graders. Airstrips that should have taken weeks to construct appeared in 72 hours. Supply depots materialized overnight. Fuel storage, ammunition dumps, medical facilities, all the infrastructure of modern warfare assembled itself with mechanical speed that Japanese officers refused to believe until they witnessed it personally. A captain named Tanaka, captured during the Marianas Campaign, described the experience to fellow prisoners on Guadalcanal. His unit had fortified a position on Saipan for 3 months. They had dug bunkers into volcanic rock, constructed interlocking fields of fire, stockpiled ammunition for a prolonged defense. Japanese doctrine promised that well-prepared positions could hold for weeks against any assault, bleeding the enemy until negotiation became preferable to continued casualties. The American bombardment began at dawn on June 15, 1944. Naval guns from battleships and cruisers pounded the beach defenses for hours. Then the landing craft appeared. Tanaka expected infantry. He saw tanks with bulldozer blades. The armored vehicles pushed through obstacles that had taken weeks to construct, shoving aside barricades and filling anti-tank ditches with debris. Behind them came regular bulldozers, operated by Seabees, who had landed in the first wave. They were clearing paths through minefields, grading routes for supply trucks, preparing the beach for logistics operations, while combat was still ongoing. Tanaka's carefully prepared defensive position held for 6 hours. His unit had expected to resist for 6 weeks. The ratio was not 100-1 or 500-1. For fortified positions, American mechanization achieved advantages closer to 1,000-1. Defenses that consumed months of Japanese labor were reduced in hours by concentrated firepower and combat engineering. The mathematics that Yamamoto had calculated on Guadalcanal proved conservative. Reality was worse. Japanese command struggled to comprehend what was happening. Their strategic planning assumed American forces would follow predictable patterns. Assault an island, suffer casualties, pause to rebuild strength, prepare the next operation over months. This assumption was built into every defensive calculation. Japanese garrisons were positioned to delay to bleed, to make each conquest expensive enough to discourage the next. But American industrial capacity had broken this logic entirely. They did not pause. They did not rebuild. They simply continued advancing, replacing losses with fresh equipment and personnel shipped from factories that operated around the clock. The production figures were staggering. American shipyards launched more naval vessels in 1943 than Japan had built in the previous decade. Aircraft factories produced planes faster than pilots could be trained to fly them. Tank production exceeded all Axis powers combined. But this was not the only challenge facing Japanese strategy. Something else was happening that the prisoners discussed in hushed voices. The Americans were not just winning battles, they were skipping islands entirely. Japanese garrisons that had prepared elaborate defenses found themselves bypassed, cut off, left to starve, while American forces attacked positions further along the supply chain. The island-hopping strategy made mockery of Japanese defensive doctrine. All those months of fortification, all that human labor poured into bunkers and trenches and artillery positions, wasted. The Americans simply went around obstacles that seemed too costly to assault directly. They had the logistics to support longer supply lines. They had the naval superiority to isolate bypassed garrisons. They had the industrial capacity to build new bases wherever they chose, rather than capturing existing ones. Rabaul, the fortress that Japanese command had spent years fortifying, was bypassed entirely. 100,000 Japanese troops sat uselessly while American forces seized positions that made Rabaul strategically irrelevant. The garrison eventually surrendered in 1945 without ever fighting the decisive battle they had prepared for. Their sacrifice had been nullified by American logistics. The psychological impact on Japanese forces was catastrophic. Soldiers who had been promised that their fortifications would hold, that their sacrifices would matter, that their deaths would delay American advance, discovered that none of this was true. American mechanization had broken the fundamental contract between Japanese military command and the men it sent to die. The prisoners on Guadalcanal watched this realization spread through each new group of captives. Men arrived broken not by combat, but by understanding. They had built defenses for months. They had prepared to die honorably in positions they expected to hold for weeks. The Americans had erased everything in hours sometimes, without even bothering to assault directly. Yamamoto recognized the pattern from his engineering training. Japanese doctrine treated defensive positions as force multipliers. A well-fortified soldier was worth 5 or 10 attackers. This multiplication justified the enormous labor investment in fortification. But American mechanization had inverted the equation. Their machines were the force multipliers now. A single bulldozer-equipped tank was worth hundreds of infantry attempting to breach obstacles manually. A Seabee battalion with proper equipment could build assault infrastructure faster than defenders could prepare countermeasures. The multiplication worked in America's favor at every level. Their advantages compounded while Japanese defensive mathematics collapsed. The battle that demonstrated this most completely was POWs. Yamamoto learned about it from prisoners who arrived in late 1944. Hollow-eyed men who had witnessed something unprecedented even by Pacific War standards. The island was supposed to be a quick operation. American planners estimated 4 days to secure POWs airfield and eliminate Japanese resistance. They had underestimated Japanese fortification depth. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa had spent months preparing defenses unlike anything Americans had encountered. His forces had carved an underground fortress into POWs' coral ridges. 500 caves connected by tunnels. Multiple levels of defensive positions. Artillery and mortars pre-registered on every approach. Nakagawa had abandoned the doctrine of beach defense. He would let Americans land, then bleed them in the interior where their mechanization advantages were minimized. The assault began September 15, 1944. Marines hit the beaches expecting light resistance. They encountered devastating fire from positions they could not see. The first day cost over 1,000 American casualties. The 4-day estimate stretched to 4 weeks, then longer. But here was where mechanization reasserted itself. While infantry struggled against Nakagawa's cave defenses, Seabees landed construction equipment and began building infrastructure. Within 48 hours of the initial assault, they had a functioning airstrip operational. Within a week, they had constructed roads, supplied dumps, and medical facilities capable of supporting prolonged operations. The logistics that Japanese defenders expected to exhaust proved inexhaustible. American forces could sustain combat indefinitely. They brought up flamethrower tanks, armored bulldozers, specialized demolition equipment designed for cave warfare. Each Japanese defensive innovation was met with mechanical countermeasure. The fighting lasted 73 days. Japanese forces inflicted over 9,000 American casualties, more than any operation since Guadalcanal. But they lost everything. Of approximately 11,000 Japanese defenders, only 347 survived to be captured. Nakagawa committed suicide as his position collapsed. His carefully prepared fortress had been reduced systematically by American engineering and firepower. Every cave sealed with explosives or incinerated with flamethrowers. Every tunnel collapsed by demolition charges. Every position that human labor had carved from coral over months was destroyed in days once American forces brought proper equipment to bear. The mathematics remained devastating even in Japan's most successful defensive operation. 11,000 defenders killed to inflict 9,000 casualties, a ratio that seemed favorable until you calculated replacement capacity. America could absorb 9,000 casualties and continue advancing without pause. Japan could not replace 11,000 trained defenders. The strategic implications became clear through 1944 and into 1945. Japanese defensive doctrine was not merely failing. It was accelerating American victory by consuming irreplaceable Japanese manpower in positions that could not be held. Every soldier who died defending an island was a soldier who would not defend the home islands. Every month spent fortifying Pacific positions was resources not spent preparing for the invasion everyone knew was coming. American mechanization had turned Japanese strategy against itself. The more Tokyo invested in Pacific defense, the weaker metropolitan Japan became. Prisoners discussed this openly by late 1944. The propaganda about holding sacred ground, about fighting to the last man, about making Americans pay for every inch, all of it, was lies. Americans paid with machines and industrial output. Japan paid with lives it could not afford to lose. The numbers told the complete story. By late 1944, American forces had captured or bypassed Japanese positions across thousands of miles of Pacific Ocean. They had constructed over 100 major airfields, dozens of naval bases, countless supply depots, and logistics facilities. They had done this while fighting a simultaneous war in Europe that consumed even more resources. The industrial capacity was so vast that the Pacific Theater represented a fraction of American military production. Japan, meanwhile, had lost the ability to replace losses. Their merchant fleet had been decimated by submarines. Their oil supplies were critically depleted. Their factories were beginning to suffer from raw material shortages that would only worsen as American forces tightened the blockade. Yamamoto understood that he was watching the final stages of a war that had been decided years earlier. The bulldozer he had witnessed on Guadalcanal in August 1942 had been merely a symbol. Behind that single machine stood an industrial civilization capable of producing millions of tons of steel, billions of gallons of fuel, endless streams of equipment and supplies that Japanese production could never match. Every Japanese soldier who died fighting American mechanization was not a hero defending his nation. He was a victim of strategic incompetence by commanders who had known the production disparity before the war and attacked anyway. The prisoners learned about the B-29 raids in late 1944. American bombers were striking Japanese cities from bases in the Marianas Islands that had been Japanese territory months earlier. The same industrial capacity that produced bulldozers produced bombers. The same factories that made construction equipment made incendiary bombs. The mechanization that had seemed impressive when applied to building airfields became terrifying when applied to burning cities. Yamamoto thought about his family in Tokyo. He wondered if the machines he had watched construct infrastructure were now constructing the means to destroy everything he had known. But the prisoners on Guadalcanal did not yet know the full scope of what American industrial capacity was preparing. They had witnessed construction and destruction. They had seen islands transformed and armies annihilated. They had calculated ratios that proved Japanese defeat was mathematically inevitable. What they could not imagine was the scale of devastation that same industrial capacity would soon unleash. The bulldozers had been the beginning. The bombers were the middle. Something else was coming that would make everything before seem almost merciful by comparison. In Part 4, we will follow the war to its conclusion and beyond. We will see what happened to Lieutenant Yamamoto when he finally returned to a Japan that had been transformed by American industrial power. We will learn what the prisoners discovered about the true cost of the war they had fought. And we will understand why the mathematics of mechanization that Yamamoto calculated on Guadalcanal would haunt Japanese strategic thinking for generations. The story of one man watching one bulldozer was never really about construction. It was about the moment an ancient warrior culture collided with industrial modernity and discovered that courage, sacrifice, and spiritual strength meant nothing against factories that could build faster than any army could destroy. In Part 1, Lieutenant Teeshi Yamamoto stood behind barbed wire on Guadalcanal and watched a single American bulldozer accomplish what would have taken 200 Japanese soldiers a week. In Part 2, he witnessed the Seabees transform that island into a military complex in 5 months' work that should have required years. In Part 3, he learned how American mechanization crushed Japanese defensive positions across the Pacific, reducing months of fortification to rubble, in hours bypassing entire garrisons, and demonstrating that industrial capacity had rendered warrior spirit obsolete. He calculated the mathematics of defeat with an engineer's precision. He understood that Japan had lost the war before it truly began. But throughout 90 minutes of this story, we have focused on what Yamamoto witnessed. Now we must ask a different question. What happened to the man who understood? What became of the engineer who calculated his nation's doom from behind American wire? The answer involves a twist that nobody could have predicted. Because sometimes the greatest burden is not dying for your country. It is surviving long enough to watch everything you believed proven catastrophically wrong. The war ended on August 15, 1945. Emperor Hirohito announced surrender in a radio broadcast that most Japanese citizens struggled to understand because he spoke in formal court Japanese rather than plain speech. Yamamoto heard the news in the prisoner enclosure on Guadalcanal, now a permanent facility housing thousands of captured Japanese soldiers. The announcement brought no celebration among the prisoners. Most sat in stunned silence. Some wept. A few retreated into themselves, entirely unable to process that the sacrifice they had been promised would matter, had been rendered meaningless. Yamamoto felt something different. He felt vindication. Every calculation he had made since August 1942 had proven correct. The industrial disparity he had recognized watching that first bulldozer had determined the war's outcome exactly as mathematics predicted. Japan could not have won. The propaganda about spirit overcoming steel had always been a lie told by commanders who knew better but sent millions to die anyway. Repatriation began in late 1945. Yamamoto returned to Japan in December aboard an American transport ship, the same type of vessel that had brought bulldozers to Guadalcanal 3 years earlier. He arrived in Yokohama Harbor expecting to find the nation he had left in 1941. What he found was something else entirely. The cities were gone. Tokyo had been reduced to ash by firebombing. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, all the industrial centers that should have produced the machines Japan needed, all of them burned. The destruction was so complete that Yamamoto could not orient himself in neighborhoods where he had once lived. Streets he had walked as a student no longer existed. Buildings where he had studied engineering were piles of rubble. The mechanization that had seemed so impressive when applied to construction had been applied to destruction with systematic thoroughness that defied comprehension. He found his family in late December after weeks of searching through refugee centers and government records. His mother had survived the firebombing by evacuating to relatives in the countryside. His younger brother, the one conscripted for factory labor, had died in March 1945, when American bombers destroyed the aircraft plant where he worked. The brother had been 19 years old. He had spent the last year of his life building planes that could not stop the bombers that killed him. Yamamoto did not cry when he learned this. He had calculated too many deaths by then. He understood his brother's fate as another data point in the mathematics of industrial warfare. Japan had sent boys to build weapons in factories that became targets. America had sent machines to destroy those factories with mechanical indifference. The equation balanced exactly as arithmetic required. Yamamoto returned to Waseda University in early 1946 to complete his engineering degree. The campus had been partially destroyed in the firebombing, but classes resumed in surviving buildings with salvaged equipment. He sat through lectures that taught the same Japanese engineering methods he had learned before the war. The calculations for human labor requirements. The formulas for manual construction projects. The assumptions about muscle power as the basic unit of work. None of it had been updated. The professors were teaching engineering principles that had been proven obsolete on Guadalcanal in 1942, and they seemed unaware anything was wrong. He wanted to stand up and shout that everything they taught was useless now. That he had watched American machines make these calculations irrelevant. That the entire Japanese approach to engineering had been surpassed so completely that continuing to teach it was almost criminal. But he said nothing. He completed his degree in silence, carrying knowledge that his professors did not possess and could not understand. But the real legacy of what Yamamoto witnessed was not personal. It was civilizational. The Seabees did not disappear after World War II. They remained an integral part of American military capability, evolving their equipment and techniques through decades of technological advancement. The construction battalions that had transformed Pacific Islands with D-7 bulldozers eventually operated machinery that made those wartime models look primitive. Modern military engineering equipment can move Earth at rates that would have seemed impossible even to the Seabees of 1944. The fundamental principle remains unchanged. Mechanization multiplies human capability by factors that manual labor cannot approach. During the Korean War, Seabee battalions constructed airfields and supply infrastructure that supported United Nations operations across the peninsula. They built in winter conditions that would have stopped human labor crews using heated equipment and specialized techniques developed from Pacific experience. The mathematics that Yamamoto calculated on Guadalcanal applied equally in Korea. American forces could construct and repair faster than enemies could destroy. Vietnam brought new challenges and new mechanical solutions. Seabees constructed entire bases from jungle terrain, including the massive installations at Da Nang and Cam Ranh Bay. They built roads through terrain that seemed impassable, bridged rivers that local populations had never crossed, created infrastructure that transformed military logistics across Southeast Asia. The equipment had evolved beyond recognition from World War II models, but the philosophy remained identical. Machines do the hard work. Humans operate machines. Industrial capacity determines capability. This approach spread beyond American forces. Every major military power studied Seabee methods after World War II. Soviet engineers adopted mechanized construction techniques that mirrored American approaches. European armies rebuilt their engineering doctrines around equipment rather than labor. Even Japan, the nation that had been defeated by American mechanization, completely transformed its military and civilian construction philosophy. Japanese companies that had once relied on human labor became world leaders in construction equipment manufacturing. Komatsu, founded in 1921, evolved into a global competitor to Caterpillar, producing bulldozers and excavators that exported Japanese engineering worldwide. The numbers tell the complete story. During World War II, American Seabees constructed over 400 advanced bases across the Pacific and Atlantic theaters. They built more than 100 major airfields, countless miles of bridges, capable of supporting the heaviest military equipment and port facilities that handled millions of tons of supplies. They accomplished this work with approximately 325,000 personnel at peak strength, a force that performed construction equivalent to what would have required millions of laborers using pre-mechanization methods. Conservative estimates suggest that Seabee mechanization saved at least 50,000 American lives during World War II alone. Troops who would have died performing manual labor in combat zones, or whose operations would have been delayed by slower construction timelines. The machines did not just work faster. They worked safer, removing human bodies from dangerous tasks and reducing casualties from accidents, exhaustion, and disease. But the deepest lesson from Yamamoto's story is not about equipment or production statistics. It is about the nature of strategic thinking itself. Japanese military command knew American industrial capacity before the war. The production figures were published. The factory counts were available. The disparity was not secret. They attacked anyway, convincing themselves that intangible factors would overcome material disadvantage. Spirit would defeat steel. Willpower would overcome production lines. The warrior tradition of centuries would prove superior to mere mechanical efficiency. This was not merely wrong. It was a category error so fundamental that it guaranteed defeat before the first shot was fired. The Japanese command had confused what they wished to be true with what was actually true. They had elevated cultural mythology to strategic doctrine and sent millions to die for beliefs that physics and mathematics could not support. Every soldier who died defending Pacific Islands against American mechanization was a victim of this delusion. Every laborer who exhausted himself building fortifications that would be erased in hours was sacrificed to mythology that commanders should have known was false. The pattern repeats throughout military history. Organizations that invest heavily in existing approaches resist innovations that threaten those investments. Generals who built careers on cavalry tactics opposed tanks. Admirals who commanded battleship fleets dismissed aircraft carriers. Leaders who rose through established systems defended those systems against evidence that they had become obsolete. The Seabees represented something more threatening than new equipment. They represented a new philosophy, a way of thinking about military capability that prioritized machines over men, logistics over heroism, industrial output over warrior spirit. This philosophy was correct. It won the war. But accepting it required abandoning beliefs that had defined military culture for centuries. And there is one final detail that most histories overlook. A truth that only emerged decades after the war ended. The bulldozer that Yamamoto watched on Guadalcanal in August 1942 was not merely a construction tool. It was part of a deliberate strategic demonstration. American military planners understood that Japanese observers, including prisoners, would witness Seabee operations. They understood that reports would eventually filter back through various channels. They wanted Japanese forces to see American mechanization. They wanted the psychological impact that Yamamoto experienced to spread throughout Japanese military culture. The demonstration was intentional. Not in the sense that individual Seabees were performing for audiences, but in the sense that American commanders knew their construction capability was a weapon in itself. Demoralization through demonstration. Breaking enemy will by showing them capabilities they could not match. Documents declassified in the 1980s revealed that American intelligence tracked Japanese prisoner reactions to Seabee operations. They collected reports on psychological state, noting which prisoners showed signs of comprehension, which experienced what we would now call cognitive collapse, which began cooperating more fully after witnessing American construction capability. Yamamoto's observations, his careful calculations, his growing horror at the mathematics of industrial warfare. All of this was anticipated and welcomed by American planners. They were fighting a war of perception alongside the physical conflict. They wanted Japanese forces to understand that resistance was mathematically futile. The bulldozers were weapons of psychological warfare as much as construction tools. This explains something that puzzled historians for decades. Why did Japanese resistance patterns change so dramatically after 1943? Why did surrender rates increase, even as propaganda continued, demanding death before capture? Part of the answer was simple military pressure. But part of it was the spreading understanding that Yamamoto had reached on Guadalcanal. Word filtered through the Japanese military that American construction capability was beyond anything they had imagined. Soldiers heard rumors about machines that did the work of hundreds of men. They learned that fortifications built over months were being destroyed in hours. The knowledge broke something in Japanese military psychology. It made the propaganda about spirit overcoming steel seem obviously false. It created cognitive space for surrender by demonstrating that death would accomplish nothing. So what happened to Lieutenant Teeshi Yamamoto? He completed his engineering degree at Waseda and spent the next 4 decades working in Japanese construction. He helped rebuild the cities that American bombs had destroyed using increasingly mechanized methods that would have been unthinkable in pre-war Japan. He lived to see his country transform from a devastated former empire into an economic powerhouse built on the same principles of mechanization and industrial efficiency that had defeated it. He never published his observations. He never wrote memoirs. He never sought recognition for understanding years before anyone else exactly why Japan would lose. He simply worked building things, watching machines do what human labor once did, calculating ratios that improved with each generation of equipment. He died in 1994 at the age of 79. His family found notebooks in his belongings filled with calculations, labor equivalencies, machine efficiency ratios, comparisons between Japanese and American methods spanning 5 decades. He had never stopped calculating. He had never stopped trying to understand exactly what he had witnessed on Guadalcanal in August 1942, when a single bulldozer rolled off an American transport ship and changed everything he believed about warfare, about his nation, and about the meaning of sacrifice. From a civil engineering student watching through barbed wire to the realization that would haunt him for 50 years. Yamamoto understood before almost anyone that the age of human labor warfare had ended, that machines had replaced muscles as the fundamental unit of military capability. That spirit and sacrifice meant nothing against factories that could produce faster than any army could destroy. And because American industry recognized this truth, while Japanese culture denied it, approximately 3 million Japanese soldiers and civilians died in a war that mathematics had decided before the first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor. That is the lesson of the bulldozer on Guadalcanal. Not that American machines were impressive, though they were. Not that Japanese resistance was futile, though it was. The lesson is simpler and more terrible. When reality conflicts with belief, reality always wins. The only question is, how many people die before the believers finally accept what was true all along? If you know other stories of innovations that seemed crazy but changed history, share them in the comments. This is just one of hundreds of moments where someone saw the future clearly, while everyone around them remained blind. Subscribe to discover more hidden turning points that shaped our world. Because history is not made by those who follow established wisdom. It is made by those who recognize when that wisdom has become obsolete.